get to the valuations of the shares, I'd like to understand assets, liabilities, those, before we get to that.
Through Commissioner, I'll be reading paragraph 33. F-grade poultry's total assets are currently 1.55 billion and comprise trade receivables, biological assets, inventory, cash, and net property, plant and equipment, which is the biggest contributor of total assets. Due to the technical insolvency, the PIC will put as a condition that the 1.1 billion in non-current assets be held as security. Shareholders' equity is negative 254 million and projected at 311 million in 2015, but expected to grow post-transaction from PIC, from 2016. The effective date accounts show a positive net asset value of 67 million due to the current improvement in performance and the positive share capital account.
Can you explain to the Commission when we say the business was technically insolvent, what does that mean?
Through you, Commissioner, technical insolvency will mean that the liabilities of the company exceed its assets.
Now, can you explain to the Commission why the PIC would still invest in a company that is said to be technically insolvent? I don't understand financials, so can you just explain that?
Through you, Commissioner, on insolvency, you'll generally get what we refer to as technical insolvency and factual or commercial insolvency. So, in technical, you're talking about from an accounting point of view, like financial statements are prepared in accordance with certain accounting standards. So that's when you would say the liabilities exceed the assets. But you have a situation where it's the more important part is commercial insolvency. Is the company able to pay its debts in the ordinary course of business? So sometimes you could end up with a situation where a company has its liabilities exceeding its assets, but based on accounting convention, but it's still able to commercially sustain itself. For us, in this particular transaction, we would have been looking at it on the business fundamentals going forward, based on the research that we had, and we believed that the company had prospects and that it would turn around.
What Professor Katz would refer to as business rescue.
Chair, in this particular case, we did not see the need for a business rescue situation because we are the owner of the asset and the largest funder. So it's negotiating with ourselves. So hence we didn't see the
you're
need.
absolutely correct, because business rescue will require an administrator.
Yes, that's true. And just to indicate, because there are numbers mentioned in those paragraphs, just to mention that in valuations, and we can come to that now, is that what's the net asset value or on a balance sheet is not normally, most cases, in 99% of the cases, not how the valuation of a company is determined. So I will come to that now and I can give clarification as we go. So on paragraph 25, valuations are based on how much free cash flow an asset can generate in the future. That is the cash that is left after paying expenses, taxes, and capital expenditure. If we are using a discounted free cash flow method, this is projected into the future, and because 100 rand earned 1 year from now is not the same as 100 rand earned today, that future cash flow is discounted at a rate to bring it to today's money's worth. Today's value will be the sum of all the future cash flows that you can derive from the asset. In other words, 100 Rand 1 year from now is worth, say, 90 Rand 90 cents today, because you could earn interest of 9 Rand 10 over 1 year if we assume an interest rate or discount rate of 10%. Sometimes people base the value of an asset on relative values, that is, the value of similar assets using a common benchmark. For example, sometimes a company is valued at a certain multiple, say 10 times of the profits of a company. The methods I mentioned in the immediately preceding 2 paragraphs are by far the most common methods of valuations used internationally. These 2 methods were used in determining the value of the shares in Daybreak, which I shall now explain. During Mr. De Jonge's testimony, it was stated that the shares in Daybreak was worth between 600 million and 800 million at the time of making the investment. I would like to first start by explaining to the Commission of Inquiry the approach followed in supporting the valuation of 1.2 billion rand. In the table below is the value provided by the service provider, that is basis points capital, indicative value provided by the Industrial Development Corporation, and 2 valuations commissioned by the sellers, namely Investec Bank and Standard Chartered. Investec Bank had valued the business at between 1.2 billion and 1.5 billion. Standard Chartered had valued it at between 1.1 billion and 1.4 billion. The IDC had valued it at approximately 1.1 billion. Basis points had provided a range of between 1.2 and 1.4. And if we take the average of this, we are talking about roughly 1.24 billion. All of the above valuations is based on projected earnings or cash flows. Inherently, the risk is that the value may be misstated because of over or underestimation of earnings or cash flow. We will accept that the Investec Bank and Standard Chartered valuations have been biased in their valuations because the valuation was done on behalf of the seller. Therefore, we will disregard these valuations because of this risk of bias. The value of any asset is the present value of the cash flows that can be generated from that asset. This necessarily requires a forecast to be made of such cash flows. Inherently, as I mentioned, there is a risk of over or understatement of the asset's value, as actual cash flows may vary from forecasted cash flows. However, we now have the benefit of hindsight, and we can therefore substitute actual cash flow figures in place of the forecasted cash flows at the time of making the investment. Such an exercise will give us an indication of the fairness of the value arrived at the time of making the investment. Below are 3 different scenarios using the benefit of hindsight to test the valuation of 1.2 billion it should be paid for Daybreak shares. The one is to use we'll use the independent valuation model that was done by basis points capital, but replace the forecast cash flows with actual cash flows. So that was one basis that we used. The second was to use a current actual offer from an arm's length third party and discount it back to when PIC made the investment rate at the same discount rate used in the independent valuation model. Then the third exercise we had done was to use enterprise value to EBITDA, meaning earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, multiples of 9 recently concluded poultry transactions that was done internationally, and apply this to the actual EBITDA numbers, and thereafter deduct the actual debt. When we perform the first using the first basis, the valuation of the shares in Daybreak came out to 1.16 billion rand. When we performed the second, the exercise on the second basis, the valuation of shares in Daybreak came out at 1.22 billion rand. And then when we performed the third exercise, the valuation of the shares in Daybreak came up at 1.35 billion rand. And so if we took the average of the three valuations, it comes out at 1.25 billion rand. With the benefit of hindsight, one can establish that the purchase price paid for the acquisition of shares in Daybreak was fair, and there is no evidence to suggest there was an overvaluation.
Can I ask a slightly different question? Taking that there's no overvaluation at the time of purchase, but in actual fact the entity got into real financial difficulty. So whatever the valuation was, if it had not been able to turn around in the way that it did, that would have been money under the bridge.
That's true.
Right. So the valuation is one thing, and perhaps later you address the question of going concern and risk assessment. Because I think that the risk assessment documents warrant a closer look as well, and we will come to that in your evidence. But it's overvaluation or undervaluation is, I mean, I think that what you've presented here is one aspect of it. The reality is that if you hadn't stepped in and supported subsequently with additional funds and people, all of that would have been gone.
Yes.
Just another question here. Why do you think that Mr. De Jong felt that the valuation was between 600 to 800 million?
Through you, Commissioner, it was based on the fact that at that point in time, we were getting unsolicited offers coming from different parties, and which was coming in mainly around the 600 million rather than the 800 million. However, it's my belief that some of these valuations, they were, I think there's evidence that there was collusion somewhere. But I don't want to name the parties, but I think we have evidence that there was collusion, collusive behavior in trying, parties coming up with, always coming up with 600 million.
Come again there, sorry. Come again there. So you are saying there were people who wanted to buy the business and they were putting offers of 600 million.
Yes.
And you say there was collusion between who and who? You don't have to mention names, but just what did that collusion mean?
Through you, Commissioner, I think that, I mean, it was known in the market that Daybreak was going through tough times. And, you know, when we deployed or put whatever interventions in Daybreak, we did it on the basis that we wanted the company turned around. We didn't want it disposed. But if we go through several instances, it looked like the people who we had entrusted to turn it around was more keen on selling the business rather than turning it around.
So basically you are saying the people that you funded wanted to sell the business for 600 million rands?
No, not that. That's when, after we, as PIC, had basically taken over, that we had appointed service providers to assist in the turnaround of the company. And I think that through you, Commissioner, if you may, I think my colleague Tabiso Moshikara has also been requested to do a statement on more on the operating aspects of the transaction, and perhaps we can cover a lot of that in that, if you will allow me.
So you're saying that these amounts came through because of that unsolicited bids which were coming around, but you say there was some collusion in terms of the little number, the smaller number versus the 1.2 billion rands.
Yes,
Is that what I'm hearing?
yes, that's true.
Okay, all right.
Commissioner, I will now move to paragraph 43, dealing with the financial structure of the daybreak transaction. The company's issued share capital was a nominal 100 rand, with PIC holding 36 ordinary shares of 1 rand each. The balance of the shares was held by, it should be the FPO consortium of 64 shares and the and staff of 10 shares. On 2nd April 2015, PIC provided funding of approximately 1.2 billion rand, comprising debentures of 892 million rand and senior debt of 300 million rand.
Sorry, Commissioner, can I please be protected from the aircon? I can't even think where, it's so cold.
I suppose what we can do now is to take a short break to see what can be done. It is cold, we can also feel it. I think we'll take a break until 11.
Thank you, Commissioner.
In the meantime, we'll ask the people to do something about the air conditioning.
FCRI poultry business was funded by the shareholder. So what we basically bought, we bought the shareholder, the nominal equity and the shareholder claims. That's basically what we had done with the funds. And I know on 3rd of October 2017, PIC converted...
Just a question, Mr. Raja. So the loans, were they owned by AFGRI or it was the banks?
It was owned by FCRI.
Okay.
So it was shareholder loans.
Yeah, shareholder loans. Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, so if we take into account that the equity was nominal, we basically bought the shareholder loan.
Question. If we go to F of the blue file, F of the blue file is extracts from the minutes of the private equity priority sector and small medium enterprise fund investment panel meeting held on the 2nd of April 2015. And if we go to paragraph 11.18 thereof, bulletproof number, not bullet, number 3, can you quickly read that into the record? I have a question regarding that.
Well, to you, Commissioner, it is first noted the following. The issue of perceived insolvency was a concern. The numbers had to be considered. Risk had noted that with the Kinross Mill inclusion, the company's balance sheet looked healthy.
Now my question regarding this is, without Kinross Mill, would PIC still have invested in the company if that wasn't included?
Commissioner, if you would allow me, I'd like my colleague Tabiso Moshikara to answer that question.
Sorry, Commissioner, Mr. Moshikara has not been sworn in, so...
I think you can take advice from him and then tell us.
Through you, Commissioner, the reason for the inclusion of the Kinross mill in the transaction was that we wanted a backward integrated operation, so you are in control of your feed. So what would happen if you've got that? You'll reduce the cost of feed instead of procuring it from somebody else where there's a profit margin on it. Part of our agreement with AFGRI is that we wanted Kinross to be part of that transaction. Otherwise it would have made it a bit more difficult for us to successfully conclude the transaction.
So without the mill, PIC wouldn't have invested in this?
That's true.
Can I also ask, can we just turn to D of the same file? We have the funded investment panel risk report, and I'd like him to just read D, page 10. Just both of them.
Through you, Commissioner, on page 10, 2 risks are identified under financial risk. The first one being insolvency risk. That is a risk that the company total assets are less than its total liabilities. The risk mitigant is Mr. Muponia to be operationally involved in the company, providing direction and implementation of the strategy. The risk is considered to be of medium level. The financial statements reflects that the company is insolvent. Incorporation of Kinross Mill in the numbers alleviates the insolvency status of the company. The next financial risk is a financial forecast risk. That's a risk that the assumptions considered might not be reasonable. Basis points, the risk mitigant is basis points capital was appointed by the parties to provide due diligence services with respect to the proposed acquisition of AVGRI. As part of the scope of its services, a financial due diligence report was produced. A copy of this report was provided to PIC on a reliance basis. Basis Points Capital performed a review of the valuation by management and the reasonableness of the calculated purchase price. The risk level is considered medium. And the comments from risk, this risk is considered medium. The assumptions and methodology utilized are reasonable. At the conclusion of acquisition of AVGRI Group by ACRI Group, AVGRI Poultry, including the animal feed division, was valued at 970 million. It is argued that an evaluation was done at acquisition of AVGRI by ACRI Group. AVGRI Poultry was producing 1.1 million birds per week. Currently, there is an upgrade at the Dalmas Abattoir to increase capacity to 1.7 million birds per week. Will be in place at the effective date. Previously, the company was individually quick frozen was 66% of total product mix, which negatively affected the net sales value as it is a low quality product. This has since been reduced to increase the fresh products, which will have positive impact in the net sales.
Now, my question here is, it seems as if PIC actually went at length.
We find it difficult to hear you.
Sorry, Commissioner. It seems like PIC actually went an extra mile to try and get this deal through. If you're telling me that without the Kinross Mill, then PIC wouldn't have invested in this. I'm just worried. I might be wrong, but earlier on you were explaining the fiduciary duty vis-a-vis that. But what I'm saying is the fiduciary duty of the PIC vis-a-vis its clients, the GPF, to invest in transactions that are going to, we're going to have returns on investment, as opposed to being a Rescue 911 place. Yes, but can you just explain to the Commission what your stance is, considering that without Kinross Mill, PIC wouldn't have considered this transaction? Can you just explain that?
Yes, Commissioner, as I mentioned, is that in the poultry operations, you want to be in control of your feed. You're in control of your inputs, you're in control of the costs. But if we wanted to have the Kinross Mill as part of the transaction in order to make it a viable transaction. Now, if we look at what we have done, and now we can talk with hindsight, because if we're going to look at the daybreaks, I mean, the last audited accounts had EBITDA sitting at 485 million rand. And I think a large portion of that, and as I explained earlier, the feed price constitutes about 40% of the cost. So it's an important cost to control. And that would have contributed significantly towards us turning around the company. So I don't think, if we look at the asset, yes, when we had taken over, the asset was a distressed asset, but you have to take into account that the poultry asset in F3 Holdings was a non-core asset. So we also saw that as an opportunity, because if we take it out and make it part of someone's core business, you are more likely to gain upside from it. And for us, it would be better for us to buy something where there's an investment thesis, where we believe in the fundamentals, because you'll get it cheaper. Then, let's say we had to buy it today on the basis of its current profitability, we are going to be paying over in excess of 2 billion. We've received an offer for 2 billion, so we know that's an entry price. We think it's probably around about 2.4 billion. But that's what we would have been paying. So I think we've got that upside. We've made the returns on this asset. I think if we take within this forthcoming year, and we record 3 years of positive EBITDA, we would have fully recovered the initial investment.
Can I raise a different question on the issue of the risk reports? If one took the risk report that was presented initially, which in that same tab is tab D, which was to the FIP. I'm trying to see the date, but it doesn't seem to have a date. The essence of it is that governance risk was low, concentration risk low, experience low. These were risks identified. Insolvency medium, but the company was insolvent, so I'm not quite sure how it was medium. And the only risk that was regarded as high was the single obligor limits. And the reason seemed to be for all those low risks was the reliance on Maponya, his skill, his experience, and his capacity. When you come 1 year later, all the reasons that were reasons for low are the exact reasons for high, by the same risk assessment assessors, signed off by Mr. Magula. So to me, the question would be, you don't go into the single obligor in the latter one, and all of the questions are now high. Maponya had been asked to resign at that point in time and leave the company, whereas the precondition of the loan was that he must be actively involved in the business. The social impact is high, governance is high, industry exposure is high. Industry exposure was low before. Concentration risk and board experience and management is high. So my question is, what evaluation has the PIC done on its risk assessment over entities if you can have such a reversal of the understanding of risks that are presented to a committee to approve, and the risks when you actually then say, but look, we're in a mess and we need more money, this is it, and they're the exact opposite. What steps has the PIC taken to assess that kind of discrepancy and distortion? Because the only conclusion that I could draw from it is you want this deal to go through, therefore Maponya becomes key to the element of staying in, being active, and every risk is low. And then when you need to put more money in, every risk is high and he's got to leave. How much was it influenced by Maponya? And then my question becomes, if that's the risk around Daybreak, and it has altered so much that you've had to ask Maponya to step down, whoever asked him, or if he volunteered, what happens to all your other exposures on Maponya? Has there been on MMI, have there been an assessment and a re-evaluation of the PIC's investments there and risk assessment and exposures? And that's why I want the exposure that you have in total to MMI.
Through you, Commissioner.
Is this one you've succeeded, you've turned it around, it's making the profitability now, which is great, because then the PIC has recovered. But the question on the others, and the decision-making is the question, the validity of the decision-making, the validity of the process.
Okay, through you, Commissioner, the other investment, the first investment that was made where Mr. Moponia was the lead sponsor was on FGRI Holdings. That was done by the private equity division. That's not the, but my understanding from the transaction is it's in a different division, but that the transaction is performing, and if in relation to Mr. Moponia, it's reached a point where our obligation is due, and so he would either have to refinance it or we will exercise our pledge on the shares. But in terms of the company itself is performing. The other entity in which...
Exposure?
Exposure...
My understanding is 367 million.
Is 367 million rand. Then on SA Home Loans, we have an exposure where we had provided a loan of 480 million rand. This has been one of the top performing assets in the portfolio. At this point in time, Mr. Moponia is looking at exiting that investment. That's the status on that. Then on there's a
Sorry, just for clarity, he is exiting, PIC is not exiting.
PIC is not exiting. Commissioner, then we have an investment where we've done an approval of a facility in Makaya, a project that's involved in the affordable housing space. Of that, approximately 79, our exposure at the moment is 79 million because it's done on a drawdown basis as and when there are projects. In this particular transaction, we are in litigation with the sponsor, with Mr. Moponia, where we have basically cancelled this facility. So the matter is sitting with the legal division at the moment.
And LA Crushers?
Chair, LA Crushers is not a transaction that is that Mr. Moponia has any interest in. I think the reason we raised LA Crushers was in relation to companies which PIC had basically been controlling. So I think there was a question that arose during Mr. De Jonge's testimony of what companies do we manage. Well, in that particular case, we don't actually manage any companies, but there we have an 86% shareholding. It's a company that's in distress, so there we are actively involved in trying to turn around that company.
It's not related to MMI?
No, it's not related to Mr. Moponia, and nor is, I think during Mr. De Jonge's testimony, he mentioned that we had funded Mr. Moponia in Resurrect Healthcare Fund. That's not true. Resurrect Healthcare Fund is a fund. So the only investors in there would be PIC, for its own account, and there's institutional investors such as Eskom Pension Fund, but we have not funded Mr. Moponia on that transaction.
So what is the total exposure of the PIC to MMI, and what is it in relation to Daybreak because of the different numbers that are being used? So one could just get a clear picture of the total.
Okay, Commissioner, if you just give me a few seconds.
It's more like 2 billion 130 million rands, somewhere there. Plus 2 billion.
2 billion 126 million, that's correct.
Yeah.
126 million.
million. 2.1
billion.
2.1 billion.
That which needs to be sort of, are all of them giving you positive returns or being repaid depending on whether they're a loan or an investment?
Yes, except Makaya, the 79 million. we have an exposure. We've called up our facility there, basically. We've cancelled the balance of the facility of approximately 200 million rand, and we're in the process of calling up the 79 million that has been drawn.
Another question is, at the point of entering into Daybreak, the further exposure, I just want to find out how the other transactions were doing, and was he servicing the loans, or what was going on there? Were they performing?
Through you, Commissioner, at the point of doing Daybreak, the transactions that would have been concluded by then would have been the 480 million rand loan for the purchase of 25% in SA Home Loans, and then it would have been the 360 million rand for his purchase of shares in AFCRI. At that point in time, both were performing, and there was no default on any of the obligations.
How would you characterize the relationship between the PIC and MMI at the moment, or the PIC and Mr. Maponya?
I wouldn't say it is good at the moment, because we are in litigation with him.
MMI and Maponya separately or as one entity?
We look at MMI as being really Mr. Maponya.
Just another question. On SA Home Loans, you are saying that he needs to exit. Don't you have lock-in periods, for shareholders?
Sorry, I'm sorry to cut in. Commissioner, next week, Mr. Raja is going to come back and deal with SA Home Loans.
Oh, okay. All right. That's fine.
Commissioner, if I may proceed to the issue of fees, which is paragraph 47. On 26th of...
Just the one question. So MMI has got about 4 transactions: AFGRI, Daybreak, SA Home Loans, and Makaya. I mean, together with the other groups which we saw, don't you think people feel that there's a bit of, they're getting their transaction funded? Is it like, are these people favored or not, and all that?
Commissioner, I can't comment on it, except for, now with during this commission you hear, that's all you hear about that there's people being funded multiple times, and we at the moment in PIC there's a single obligor guideline that has already been developed, that's being tabled through the committees, so that we can have some guidance on this, where we limit the extent to which we support a single person or grouping.
So you are sort of looking into that?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
The document is going through the committees at the moment. Commissioner, I'm on paragraph 47. On the 26th of November 2016, PIC entered into an engagement letter with the MMI as the lead sponsor of the FPO consortium. In terms of clause 3.21 of the engagement letter, under the heading Utilization of Consultants, it states that PIC, in its assessment and evaluation of the transaction, may require assistance of independent experts to assist, to advise on certain aspects of the transaction. Clause 3.2.2 of the same engagement letter states that the sponsor shall be responsible for the payment of such fees and expenses incurred in respect of such services rendered by any such independent expert. If required, such fees could be capitalized and funded out of the capital raised to fund the transaction. In finalizing the transaction and concluding the due diligence, PIC had requested MMI to appoint service providers to conduct various due diligences at its own cost for the benefit of PIC. PIC and the consortium, it should have read. PIC was responsible for the scoping of the due diligence work and oversaw the selection of the service providers. This arrangement was on the understanding that should the PIC approve the investment, this fees will then be paid from the approved amount and capitalized to the required funding. At financial close, PIC, Daybreak and MMI entered into a fee letter in which an arrangement was made for the company to pay all fees incurred in finalizing the transaction. The fee letter agreement made an arrangement for 1% participation fee to be paid to PIC and 1% fee to MMI, as MMI had carried the costs of the entire consortium, including management and the staff element. In terms of the fee letters, the company was to pay approximately 23.5 million rand to both PIC and MMI. The 23.5.
Is that each?
No, in total.
The total, so it's
Yes.
split.
Yes. Chair, then I shall move to the financial commitments by PIC to Mr. Kulufelo Maponya. Some of it we have covered, but I'll read it for the record. The Commission of Inquiry requested details of commitments by PIC, whether directly or indirectly, to Mr. Kulufelo Maponya. In his testimony to the Commission of Inquiry, Mr. De Jonge indicated that PIC funded Mr. Maponya in Daybreak, AFCRI Holdings, SA Home Loans, and Razorite Healthcare Fund. PIC did not fund Mr. Maponya and Razorite Healthcare Fund. As far as I'm aware, Mr. Maponya does not have a shareholding in this fund, nor in the manager of the fund. Mr. De Jonge omitted to mention that PIC has also provided funding to Makhaya Pty Limited, a company in which Mr. Maponya is a controlling shareholder. PIC advanced 367 million rand for the AFCRI transaction. And just to clarify, that was done under the private equity division or mandate. 480 million for SA Home Loans and 79 million rand as part of a 275 million facility in respect of Makhaya. These amounts are not entirely for the benefit of Maponya, but total amounts in respect of consortiums in which he is the controlling shareholder. In respect of Daybreak, PIC or MMI was originally a 50% shareholder in Daybreak. However, PIC has exercised its pledge on these shares and now owns 100% of the shares in Daybreak.
I think you can skip the next two paragraphs.
Okay.
Two paragraphs.
Thank you.
Because we have dealt with those.
Okay, then, Mr. Commissioner, I shall now move to the matter relating to Mr. De Jonge's change in jobs. In his testimony, Mr. De Jonge states that in November 2013, I called him to my office and informed him that the CEO, Dr. Daniel Majila, did not want him to be Senior Manager Quality Assurance Due Diligence, but rather to be transferred to the deal team as Associate Principal. He further states that when he asked me for the reasons, I indicated that it was an instruction from the CEO and he was free to take this up with the CEO, but a person at his age did not have much of a choice. I have no recollection at all of this conversation. However, it is probable that his versions of events may be true, except that I doubt very much that the conversation would have been blunt in tone as it seems to come across. The latter reference to his age would in all likelihood have been said in a joking manner, and in this regard, I attach here to an email which suggests the manner in which we do correspond with each other from time to time. However, I do not recollect Mr. De Jonge expressing any dissatisfaction pursuant to his move to Associate Principal, nor am I aware that he had lodged any grievance in this regard. Mr. De Jonge's lateral transfer from Senior Manager Quality Assurance Due Diligence on 1 February 2014 and not January 2014 as stated by Mr. De Jonge was not done arbitrarily. It was pursuant to a restructure of the private equity and impact investing divisions of PIC. In terms of the restructuring, PIC management decided that these divisions were to comprise exclusively investment professionals, that is, deal-making staff, and all support functions within these divisions were to become part of PIC's support divisions or shared services. Mr. De Jonge was not the only employee affected by this. 4 other employees were affected by this decision, with them being transferred to other divisions. In all cases, the remuneration remained unchanged. Mr. Commissioner, at the point of doing the statement, I had forgotten to mention that myself, I was also affected during that point in time, and hence, you'll see I was then senior fund principal. I had been moved from general manager to senior fund principal. I was also affected by management's decision. Mr. De Jonge's function comprised an assurance element, namely oversight of the due diligence compliance, and an administrative element relating to procurement of and liaison with external service provider. These functions were absorbed by the fund principals, the risk team, and internal audit division, whilst the administrative function was taken over by the unlisted operations team. As a result, the position of manager quality assurance due diligence would have become redundant. Mr. De Jonge has indicated during his testimony that he thought his forensic background would be better applied in his capacity as senior manager quality assurance due diligence as opposed to that of an associate principal. In order to make this determination, it is necessary to map his forensic background against that of a person, his duties as head of quality assurance and due diligence, and against the position of an associate principal. Mr. De Jonge indicated in his testimony that his job entailed the following: development of a due diligence manual, liaise with due diligence service providers, ensure due diligence performed in accordance with the manual. I would like to point out that he also dealt with the process of compiling the request for proposals and being involved in the supply chain management process, monitoring the due diligence budget, processing of payments to due diligence service providers, ensuring that the due diligence was performed in accordance with the undertakings concluded with the service provider. Mr. De Jonge does not perform the due diligence, but this is done by the deal team. The job of a forensic investigator requires the gathering of evidence to support a view or validate what is represented as being the truth. This is similar to undertaking a due diligence where the objective is to validate what is purported to be the truth. The job of an associate principal is, amongst others, to conduct a due diligence. Therefore, one may conclude that the job of an associate principal better utilizes Mr. De Jonge's forensic skills background. The job of senior manager of quality assurance due diligence is more administrative. Mr. De Jonge feels that the transfer of the positions in 2014 is a demotion. I would like to highlight to the Commission that 4 years earlier, Mr. De Jonge was denied a promotion for a job which entails exactly what the job of an associate principal does. On 7th of September 2000...
Just a question there. So when he moved from your department, which department did he go to?
He remained in the same department, but his job was different.
And he was sort of reporting to you still?
Through your Commissioner, in the reporting, at a point in time when, or if I can give some background, I think it was around about, if I remember, there's a letter that the GEPS sent to us on the 3rd of November 2011, where they wanted the PIC to move towards a private equity type model, so the division must be structured along those lines, and that started the whole process of events that led to the restructuring. At that point in time, there was a decision made that Mr. De Jonge would report to the CEO, So that is what's on record and he's been given a letter to that effect. But in substance, he's always reported to, when I was as the head of division, and then when later I became senior fund principal, there were another 2 senior fund principals. He actually reported to the 3 of us, the substance of it. Commissioner, I'm on paragraph 73. On 7th of September 2009, Ms. Claire Bussetti, the then General Manager of Isibaya, wrote a motivation to the then Chief Investment Officer, Dr. Daniel Majila, for the promotion of Mr. De Jonge because he was playing a role in deal making in addition to his role as due diligence assurance provider. On 5th of October 2009, Mrs. Bussetti again made a request to the then CEO to increase his salary as well as given the increase in scope of work, including assisting deal makers in concluding deals. This request was declined by Ms. Albertina Kekana, the then Chief Operating Officer, stating, "Please note that in principle, I am not in support of extending Tinus's role to include playing deal maker on projects." The request to play a role in deal making in 2009 was seen as a promotion, but the request was declined. 4 years later, Mr. De Jonge was given this opportunity to be involved in deal making, which he sought in 2009. In addition, this deal-making role as an associate principal is now on an E2 grade, so meaning 2 grades higher than his previous position of D5. Mr. De Jonge indicated in his statement that when he joined PIC, he was supposed to have a team under him. However, this did not happen. Under the role of Associate Fund Principal, Mr. De Jonge would have available to him a team comprising investment associates and investment analysts to assist him in the execution of the due diligence. Therefore, I feel that Mr. De Jonge was not prejudiced in any way in the transfer from Senior Manager Quality Assurance Due Diligence to that of an Associate Principal. Commissioner, if I can move.
Okay, yeah, just before you go on, in his statement, Mr. De Jonge says that he was told that he shouldn't report to the CEO, he must report to you, I think, as the fund principal, but he says that he felt that he couldn't question this because, you know, at my age, he says, I don't have much choice, I must just accept this. Did you see any change in his demeanor after that? And, you know, what do you say about him being scared, you know, to raise the issues?
Through you, Commissioner, that's why I mentioned that I don't have a recollection of the conversation because there was nothing. If it was acrimonious or anything of that sort, I would remember it. And even if we look at Mr. De Jonge, there hasn't been any change in how he would ordinarily have conducted himself, and the relationship that we have is like any other. It's a satisfying, it's a normal relationship. So there's no. I don't sense any bitterness or animosity or anything. It's a normal relationship.
Yeah. And do you think that he might have been scared to raise the issue with you or the CEO, as he says in his statement?
I don't think Mr. De Jonge is scared. I know he's quite a frank person. He speaks his mind, so no, I don't believe that he'll be scared, no.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, if I can move to paragraph 78, where I'm now dealing with the status of the investment in Daybreak. The investment is performing very well, having recorded 2 consecutive years of exceptional profits. For the year ended 31 March 2018, the company recorded EBITDA of 485 million, and for the 10 months to January, it was 388 million.
Sorry, can I just ask whether the Kinross mill still forms part of the business?
Through your Commissioner, yes, it does. The 250 million rand to grow capital has been fully settled. The company has been in a cash positive position for about 2 years. All capital expenditure has been paid out of internally generated cash. The company has not borrowed any further funds. The 250 million rand additional facility from PIC has also been cancelled. Going forward, PIC will dilute its interest in the company to a non-controlling interest because the takeover of 100% was as a result of the company being in jeopardy, but the idea is that it's not for an institution to run a company. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raja. I understand you're going to come back again next week sometime. Maybe Ms. Kue has questions. Do you have questions?
No, I don't, Commissioner.
No
Thank you.
questions. Right. There's a final question here.
What is the plan with Daybreak? I mean, what's going to happen? Is the PIC going to sell it? Is going to keep it? Or are the loans being repaid?
Yes, essentially, for all intents and purposes, our exposure here is equity in nature. Mm-hmm. But at the moment, we are in discussions with another party who's in the poultry business, where we are considering a merger of the businesses. Yes.
So you don't plan to get out completely?
No, there's no intention to get out completely, because we still think from this investment we can have impact on an enterprise and supplier development basis, given the value chain in which Daybreak operates.
And create a bigger group and maybe even list it on the market or something?
Yes.
Right. Thank you very much. You're excused, Mr. Raja.
Thank you.
Ms. Kure, is that the business for the day?
That is the business for the day. Thank you, Commissioner.
Right. The commission will adjourn until Monday the 20th at 10.
Sorry, Commissioner, I didn't hear that.
No, I'm saying that the commission now adjourns until Monday the 20th at 10.
Thank you, Commissioner.